This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is Katelyn McCullock, Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, with a cattle market update. She also discusses an acreage report on corn and cow slaughter numbers. The show continues with Karen Blakeslee, K-State Extension Associate in Food Science, with food safety considerations when taking food to the field. We are also joined by USDA's Gary Crawford and Shagam as they discuss the latest hogs and pigs report. Drew Ricketts, K-State Wildlife Specialist, concludes today's show by sharing information about red foxes and coyotes in urban areas. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned into Agriculture Today, and on this Monday, we start our show as we normally do with a cattle market update. And to give us our update this week, we have the Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock. And Katelyn, as we start our conversation on the cattle markets, what are we seeing?
Well, last week we did see a little bit of price decline across the live cash price. We ended the week at 180, which is a little bit lower than maybe what we started last week with. On the feeder cattle side, the Dodge City auction did not run last week, and so no new information on the week-over-week changes there. On the box beef side, we've seen a little bit of weakness come down in the dailies. We've traded lower now for 5 straight days, ending last Friday. So we're still above $300 a hundredweight on the choice side and about $285 on the select side. It's not worrisome. Seasonally, we would expect post 4th of July to see this price come down a little bit. The big question is, how far down does it fall? On the future side of things, Friday ended the week very strong. The nearby feeder cattle all up $3 or more in September and over $2.50 in October. And these are all looking like very strong prices, hovering around that $250 marker for most of the 2023 contracts. On the live cattle side, futures were also very strong. December 183, October 179 to end the week. All very strong prices, even though we are seeing a little bit of weakness in that cutout, like I mentioned.
And in that box beef cutout portion, is there a little bit of similarity with prices between select and choice and prime choice premium?
The prime and choice grades relative to lower grade cuts and how those premiums have interacted have been a little interesting to watch. And sometimes we like to group those together. So one thing that's happening, the choice versus select spread has been relatively large, over $20 per hundredweight. And on the month of June, averaged something close to $23 to $25 a hundredweight. What's interesting is the prime minus choice spread, so the difference between those two grades, has actually come down substantially, and it's much closer to what that choice versus select spread is, and it's $23 a hundredweight is what it averaged in June. That's the lowest that spread has been in 2 years. So the last time it was in those low 20s was May of 2021, and typically we see the peaks. So those, if you remember to last year and the year before, we saw that prime versus choice spread over $80 a hundredweight in both fall quarters. And so this is typically the low point of the year for that spread, and it remains to be seen how high we'll go again this fall.
And Katelyn, something you brought up that you wanted to talk about, because you've seen it make changes for you guys there at the Livestock Marketing Information Center, is a recent acreage report on corn.
On the 30th of June, USDA NASS released the June acreage report, which is the official planted number for this growing season. And it's a highly anticipated report, and these numbers can get readjusted as they move through the growing season. But this is really what farmers told USDA what they were going to plant. And the biggest surprise was corn acres coming in over 94 million acres, which was quite a bit above where trade expected it to be, and it's about 6% higher than last year. So if you think back to what March planting intentions was, that came in just over 92 million acres. So about a 2 million acre bump there. And that's a big deal. That's a market moving phenomenon. And you've seen the futures contract react sharply after the report and has kind of settled out since then. There is drought in the Midwest, and that's something that we are addressing through yield, but it's still early enough in the growing season that we're not making large changes at this point. And so based on that huge planted number, we actually moved our season average corn price down into the mid fours. So we're looking at a price, between $4.30 and $4.50 for the 2023-2024 season average price. And we have a yield average somewhere around 176. And that gives us a billion bushel carryout of about just over 2 billion bushels. And so on the use side, we're expecting that lower price to kind of help some of those use categories use more corn. Another surprise was probably the soybean acres, which came in much lower than expected at 83.5 million acres, down about 5% from last year. Hay acres saw a rare bump up about 2.4 million acres, or about 5% over last year. And in general, the crop report showed that principal acres, which is generally a big collection of different crops, was up, and it's the largest since 2018. So it seems like we found more acres to plant, and we were able to do so based on the weather this spring. And we're not necessarily out of the woods for any of these commodities. A lot can happen. And so some of these early season price projections are going to move around quite a bit as we go through the growing season. But to have that big of a planted number come out and have it be a surprise, LMIC had to adjust all of their price forecasts based on what we think you can now feed some of these cattle out for. And so that's good news for cattle producers and cattle feeders to some extent, because we ended up raising probably our 7 to 8 weights about $10 or so across the board. And so we're looking at a season average price that's well above last year, something close to about 220, 100 weight on an annual average basis. Now that, again, we've had to move that up throughout the year, and now this big corn number, we moved it up again. If you do have some significant yield hit based on the drought that's going on in the Midwest, maybe that number comes back down, but cattle supplies remain fairly tight. On the calf side of things, 5 to 6 weights, we're looking at an annual average price of about $250 this year. So again, another very strong price, and pretty similar to, I guess, where the cattle market is right now. We're expecting this summer to be only slightly higher than maybe where you're at right now, and then the fourth quarter to come down a little bit as those new crop calves come in. On the fed cattle side, we did raise prices as well. We're up about 19% over 2022, which feels like a big number, but you've all seen the cash price. It continues to kind of charge forward, a little bit of weakness on Friday, but we're still holding on to 180, which is a fantastic fed cattle price by historical standards. In 2024, when a lot of this new crop corn will impact those feeders, we were looking at a 7 to 8 weight price closer to 275, and a 5 to 6 weight annual average price of something closer to 3.
So, Katelyn, a lot of times our grain economist that we talk to says the markets are kind of weather dependent. And so does that a little bit of transferring over to what the cattle markets are also looking like?
To some degree, they're probably not as reactive to, the week-to-week weather change, especially in the feeder cattle market. But the long-term trend has definitely been for these prices to continue to climb. And I would akin it more to adding fuel to the fire in terms of what to expect for feeder cattle prices. I thought we might see a little more weakness this summer. Now I don't think we probably will, even ahead of new crop corn. And for next year, it just means we raised our prices, that much more. That corn price will enable them to do that. So, I think what we're seeing now is quite a bit of flexibility in the cattle system. It's a pretty big change, though, from where the corn market has been in the last couple of years. And so all of these things interplay together. But probably the primary driver is still going to be that cattle supplies are tight, and they're going to pay less and less attention to the corn market as we get tighter and tighter in cattle supplies year over year.
And one more thing that is obviously important to the cattle market that you wanted to discuss was cow slaughter. And so what are we seeing there?
So year-to-date cow slaughter is down about 15% from last year. And it was expected that we probably would see a big pullback as the drought broke. We flip into an El Nino pattern. What I think is rather interesting is maybe the regional differences. And it's not that every region has not culled as many cows. You actually still have some regions that are up over a year ago, and they're not necessarily in large cow-calf states, regions 1 and 2, which are primarily, New England and the Northeast. And then we have regions like Region 3, which is maybe more that mid-Atlantic area, that's up about 18%. In Region 6, which was where a lot of the cow slaughter came from last year, that's down about 19%. But Region 7 also had some large numbers last year, and it's only down 3%. There are some differences. We're still seeing quite a bit of volume, though, move through Region 7. whereas a lot of the other regions are seeing collectively some substantially lower numbers. On the dairy cow slaughter side, which does factor into the beef production supply chain, I know we don't necessarily always like to think about it, but it's up about 2%, and their prices have come down pretty substantially in terms of milk price. But the largest change for that region was Region 6, which is going to be, again, Southern Plains, Oklahoma, Texas, stretching into New Mexico, but also Louisiana and Arkansas are all part of that Region 6. That's up 26% from last year for dairy cow slaughter by itself, followed by Region 10, which is Pacific Northwest, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and includes Alaska in that one. And so those are the only two dairy cow slaughter regions that are up over a year ago, and it was enough to drive the total figure up 2%. So the others are seeing declines, I should say, year to date. What's interesting, though, is so you have quite a bit less beef cow slaughter, a little bit more dairy cow slaughter, and yet cull cow prices continue to climb. So summer tends to be the peak of cutter cow values, and they're over $90 per hundredweight nationally. Now, seasonally, we've probably hit the peak. We'll probably head lower over the rest of the year, but I think we'll probably still stay above a year ago. So we're still expecting kind of normal seasonal trends in that specific market. And the thing to keep in mind, maybe out further, is in 2014 and 2015, these live cull cow values reached over $100 per hundredweight in the summer. And so I think you'll probably see those values next year, and probably we might outpace them in 2025.
That was the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Katelyn McCullock. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now with some food safety information that people may want to keep in mind as they might be hauling meals into fields during harvest and other points in the summer. And to discuss this topic, we have K-State Extension Associate in Food Science, Karen Blakeslee. Karen, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
First off, when I think of food preparation and eating food, clean hands are important.
Absolutely. That is your first line of defense to avoid getting sick from eating food, because your hands, you touch a lot of things, so your hands has a lot more dirt on it than you think. So that's your first thing you should do, no matter what kind of meal that you are preparing, whether it's at home or getting ready to pack up some lunch or supper for wheat harvest. So start by washing your hands when you're preparing the food. And for those of you that are out in the field, when you want to get ready to eat it, you also want to wash your hands too. So an easy thing that you can do is pack along some wash rags with soap and water, or even a jug of water with some dish soap in it and some extra wash rags, and wash your hands that way.
And so hand sanitizer may not be the solution for farmers washing their hands before they eat.
Not 100%, because hand sanitizers, they work best if you start with clean hands. If your hands are dirty to start with and you put hand sanitizer on them, it's not going to do its job. So it's best to wash your hands, get the dirt and grime off first, then use a hand sanitizer if you choose.
So at least get a layer off of maybe the oil and grease before consuming your food in your mouth.
Absolutely.
Talking about consuming food, what are some good options possibly for hauling food to a field or getting prepared?
I always like to think about this as keeping it simple. I grew up on a farm and did wheat harvest myself, and my mom and I were in charge of it, and we always tried to keep things as simple as possible. Sandwiches work well. Even a cold dish, even like a salad or something like that. That things that are cold tend to pack easier than things that are hot. It's easier to me to keep things cold than hot. So think about it that way. You can do sandwiches. You can do wraps. That would be another thing. Salads, keep those cold. One thing that is kind of a myth about potato salad in general is that the mayonnaise is the problem. The mayonnaise is not the problem. It's what you put in your potato salad. It's the potatoes and the eggs. Those are the things that really need to be kept cold. Mayonnaise and mustard, it has a lot of acid in it. So those two things get a bad rap. So you got to keep those things cold. Even like a nice leafy green salad, that's easy to keep cold too. So keep it simple. That way, because, once you get out to the field to deliver, you're probably going to have to wait on people. And so keeping things in an ice chest, that's going to be the easiest thing.
And I know a lot of times simple was important because often, the producers, at least in my family, would just come eat off the back to pick up or pick it up and go hop back in the tractor.
Exactly.
So maybe avoiding a big meal, but something simple that they can eat with their hands also.
Exactly. Yeah. Pack it to go. That's and you can even wrap things up in some wax paper or something like that so it's easier for them to hold and keep it together. And then they can eat it as they go.
And Karen, you've mentioned keeping things cold, and that's kind of feels maybe more of a common food safety thing, but keeping things hot or cold and getting them up to temperature is important.
Right. So if you do choose to take something hot, you want to get it to an appropriate temperature. So say you want to take a pot roast out there. I know people that have done that. You want to get it cooked properly first. So you want to get it to at least 145 degrees to start with because it's a full cut, piece of meat. So the minimum is 145. But then after cooking, you want to keep it above 140 for serving. So that's something to think about. If you choose to cook some hamburgers before you take them to the field, make sure you get them up to 160 first, and then keep them above 140 when you go out to the field. If you do choose to take something like chicken, get it cooked to 165 first, and then again, if you want to serve it hot, keep it above 140. So it's important to do that. Now, keeping things cold, we want to keep things below 40. Keep things in the refrigerator or freezer until you are ready to go out to the field. It's going to be hot and things warm up pretty fast. So use ice chests, use lots of ice, use the ice packs. Those are your friends, and pack things with ice around the foods so that it keeps things cold.
And keeping things cold when producers are taking maybe their sack lunch and their little coolers, keeping things cold in that also.
Exactly. So they should have a little ice pack in there or some chunks of ice to keep the sandwich cold or whatever it is.
And it's always happened. Things get left behind. Things get forgotten. It's okay just to throw it out.
It is extremely okay, especially on hot days like this. The recommendation is when the temperature is above 90 degrees outside and you've got food sitting out for over an hour, it really is best to toss that. And because in the middle of all this, you don't want to get sick. It's a stressful time the way it is, and getting sick from eating food that is not safe anymore is something that you really don't want to happen.
I'm curious about, a lot of times I know that in my family, they'll take apples, and that's okay just to put in the thing and wipe it off real quick and then eat it.
Yeah.
So fresh fruit.
Absolutely. Fresh fruit like bananas, apples, oranges, those are easy handheld type things. Even grapes, rinse them off with water. Same thing with the apples. Rinse those off, and then with grapes, put them in some kind of container, and then they're easy to eat that way. This time of year, cherries are available. That's another good one. Not just food safety to think about, but think about nutrition. Having a heavy meal may not be the ideal thing when it's hot outside, so keep it light and keep it fresh.
A big thing you've mentioned multiple times, keep it simple.
Absolutely. Because, like I said earlier, if you go out to deliver the meal and people are not ready, then you're going to have to sit there for a little bit. I remember those days. So, and that's okay. But just remember to keep things properly chilled or warm.
And if people are wanting to maybe find out some more information about food safety and maybe see those temperatures, where could they do that?
We have a food safety website. It's our Extension Food Safety website. So it is ksre.ksu.edu/food safety.
Karen, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share some helpful tips when thinking about preparing food maybe for the field or taking their lunches.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I hope everyone has a good harvest.
That was Extension Associate in K-State Food Science, Karen Blakeslee. The resource that she mentioned in today's show you can find in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a quick break, we're going to be joined by USDA's Gary Crawford and USDA livestock analyst Shayle Shagam as they discuss that there's currently not much incentive for hog producers to boost production.
Looking at the latest quarterly USDA Hogs and Pigs report, which includes producer intentions.
The signals we're getting from producers are that they are not planning on expanding production.
No, and in fact, we could see declines in production as the months and the year goes on. This from USDA livestock analyst Shayle Shagam. First, before we get to producer intentions for the future, the report has the number of sows that were farrowed during this past March through May quarter.
Producers farrowed just under 2.9 million head of sows, which was 2.4% below a year ago.
So a pretty big drop in farrowings.
But that was to some extent offset by a 3.3% increase in the number of pigs per litter, which gave a pig crop for that period of 32.9 million head, up 0.8%.
But Shagam says producers have told USDA they intend to cut farrowings even more in this current summer quarter and again in the fall quarter.
Producers indicated intentions to farrow about 2.9 million head of hogs during June-August, which would be about 4% below a year ago. Their intentions for the September-November period would be to farrow about just under 3 million head of hogs, which would be about 4.5% below a year ago.
And we are told that an increase in pigs per litter would probably not be enough to offset those kinds of cuts in farrowings. Shagam says from an economic standpoint, there is really not much incentive for producers to boost production. In fact, quite the opposite.
If we were to look at the estimated returns for average-sized farrow finish operators in Iowa, for example, returns have been negative for the most part for the year so far. And I think that is reflected in the fact that we are seeing these low farrowing numbers and we are seeing these low intention numbers.
And, of course, low hog price numbers.
Prices for hogs at the national base lean price, which is what we use here at USDA for our benchmark, at the time the survey was taken, hog prices were running about $58, $59 a hundredweight, compared to prices of about $70 for the same period of time in 2022. So again, there is a very bearish tint to what producers were seeing at that time.
Even with some improvement coming in the last week or so, hog prices are still averaging about $10 a hundredweight below this time a year ago. Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Once again, that was the USDA's Gary Crawford and USDA's livestock analyst Shayle Shagam discussing a recent hogs and pigs report from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts as he discusses red foxes and coyotes in urban areas. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show with some wildlife information. And in to talk about it, we have K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Shelby.
Drew, today you wanted to talk about red foxes and coyotes in urban areas. And so if they're in urban areas, why are they not in rural areas of Kansas anymore?
That's a very good question. So in the last probably 20 years or maybe even going back farther than that, we've seen red fox populations really moving out of rural parts of Kansas, and they now mainly exist in urban areas. And that's because of an interaction that biologists would call intra-guild predation. And that's where similar predators tend to prey on smaller predators that are similar to them, I guess. So if we have wolves, coyotes, and foxes, they're all members of the dog family. The largest predator in that group is, of course, wolves, and they end up killing coyotes because they see coyotes as a competitor. And coyotes kill foxes because they see foxes as competitors. And some evidence that we see for this comes from areas where wolves have recolonized places where they hadn't been before. And in many of those areas, coyotes have basically killed out all of the foxes from the rural areas or very much depressed their populations. And when wolves recolonize those areas, what we tend to see is that coyotes become less abundant, and they also become more vigilant, meaning they're more worried about what's going on around them because of the potential for predation from wolves. And in those areas, we tend to see the fox populations rebound.
If those coyotes and red foxes aren't really in rural areas anymore, where are they at in Kansas?
So what we're seeing now is that coyotes are very abundant in both rural areas and urban areas, or they're starting to become abundant in urban areas. But foxes mainly only exist in those towns. It might be a town of 100 all the way up to towns of several 100,000 like we see in our most urban areas of Kansas.
And so what are those foxes really doing in town?
That's an interesting question, and one of the lines of evidence that we have to draw on for what's going on with those critters right now is a recent study that's come out of Chicago where basically they have cameras, and along lines or sampling lines that we call transects, they've got cameras going from the most urban part of a city all the way out to the suburbs and even rural areas. Manhattan and Junction City were both a part of this research network that produced this study, but the results that we're looking at right now came specifically from Chicago. And what we see is that in the most urban areas, like the super developed downtown part of a big city, we see the fewest of both coyotes and foxes. And as we move towards the rural area, both coyotes and foxes become more abundant. And then when we get to the most rural areas, we see that decline in foxes again. So that gives us an opportunity to try and understand what's going on with these two species in those areas. And to get to the point, what they found was that the main thing that's going on is foxes are avoiding the potential for conflict with coyotes by being most active at the time of night when coyotes are least likely to be active. So both coyotes and foxes were less likely to be active during the day when people are active, but foxes really capitalize on the period from like 10 o'clock at night until 4 o'clock in the morning when coyotes are least likely to be active. So what we see is a temporal niche, a time of day that a critter is capitalizing on that is different between those two species.
Are one of those species a little less afraid, per se, of humans?
Foxes are probably a little bit less afraid of humans than coyotes are because people are more likely to see coyotes as a threat. Another thing that we saw was that in the parts of town where coyotes were most abundant, then foxes tended to be active at the same time as people more often than they were in areas where coyotes were not very abundant.
Drew, some interesting information as it comes to red foxes and coyotes in urban areas. I appreciate you taking the time to tell us about it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with you tomorrow.